From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to today's very exciting program. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African Middle East Division, and would like to welcome you all to our division. As most of you already know, we're made up of three sections: the African, the Near Eastern, and the Hebraic sections. We are responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire African continent, North and Sub-Saharan. We also serve these materials to patrons here in our reading room and organize programs, exhibits, conferences, and other activities that highlight these collections and that inform our patrons about the countries and the cultures these publications come from or are about. Our presentation today is a case in point. Steve McDonald, the director of the Africa program and the project on leadership and building state capacity at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, will share with us some insights on an initiative of engaging Africans in policy dialogue, the Southern Voices Network. Thank you. As he notes, this initiative stems from the concern that the Southern voice or perspective is seldom heard in debates around issues directly affecting countries of the Global South. And now to introduce him, Eve Ferguson, the reference librarian for East Africa and the host of today's program. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome to the African Middle Eastern Reading Room. Thank you for coming to our program today. I keep getting some feedback in this thing. I have the pleasure of introducing Steve McDonald. Once again, he spoke here probably about 5 years ago on peacekeeping in Burundi. And so now we're going to hear about a new initiative from the Wilson Center. I'm very pleased to have Steve here because he's somebody I've known most of my life and have a great deal of respect for because he is constantly in touch with what's going on in Africa. One of the reasons we're having this program at this time is because I believe he's shortly about to hit the road again and spends a large portion of his time throughout the continent. So when we talk about expertise on African affairs, this is somebody who truly lives it. He sent me a short bio, which is not very short, but I'm going to abbreviate it just a little bit. Mr. Steve McDonald is the director of the Africa program and the project on leadership and building state capacity at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he's worked since 2002. McDonald helped to design, initiate, and now manage the center's leadership capacity building and post-conflict resolution programs in Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Liberia. A specialist in African affairs, McDonald has focused primarily on democracy and governance, human resource development, conflict resolution and transformation, peace building, and policy formulation for Africa. McDonald has a master's degree in African politics from University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, and has lived and worked with Africa for 40 years. McDonald began his career in Africa in 1970 as an embassy officer in the U.S. Embassy in Kampala, Uganda, and that is where we became acquainted with each other many, many years ago. His 10 years in the Foreign Service included serving as political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria, South Africa, and desk officer for Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome and Principe. During these years, he served as support staff to Angola American Initiative on Rhodesia that led to Lancaster House in the Zimbabwe settlement and the 5 power negotiations on Southwest Africa, Namibia. After leaving the Foreign Service in 1980, McDonald moved to the nonprofit sector, where he has headed the U.S. South Africa Leadership Development Program and the Aspen Institute's Southern Africa Policy Forum, and then served as Executive Vice President of the African American Institute. McDonald has also taught the Francophone African course at the Foreign Service Institute, done conflict resolution work in Northern Ireland and Brazil, served as Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, managed the Africa Program for the National Endowment for Democracy, and done consultancies with DFI International, the Center for International Understanding, USAID, and the Goals for Americans Foundation. McDonald has published, edited, and written for Africa Report, the Washington Report on Africa, and many, many other publications. And so, as not to take up more of his time, because we're all interested in hearing about this new initiative, I'm going to welcome to the podium Steve McDonald. Thank you.
Always sounds good when someone else says it. Thank you very much, Eve. Eve does herself a little disservice because she doesn't tell you why she was in Uganda. Her father, Clyde Ferguson, was my first ambassador in the Foreign Service. One of the most remarkable men I ever knew. Was a mentor to me and remains dear to my heart, and I know to the Eves, so we share an awful lot in our lives. I welcome this opportunity. It's a little bit self-serving because this is a program that we're doing at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. But it was a unique opportunity for me to do something that had been preying on my mind for a very long time in my years and years of involvement in Africa. Including going back to the time when I was with the government, when I was a Foreign Service officer, a diplomat in Africa, and that's kind of the genesis of the project. And I think it's important for your understanding of it, for me to give you a little bit of that flavor. And the way it happened, actually, because I had the great luxury, which doesn't happen very often with nonprofit groups, had the great luxury of having a donor who asked me to and that was Carnegie Corporation, who asked me to give them an idea, something unique, a new initiative that they could consider. We'd been working with them on some of the fragile state work that Eve mentioned, looking at post-conflict transitions in Africa, and they wanted to do something different. And it gave me the chance to pick up on this issue that had always concerned me. And quite simply, it is, as the title would imply, the fact that consultations around policy issues that are important to the United States and Africa never have an African, or seldom have an African in the room who are contributing to that consultation, contributing to the dialogue around that issue. In my years in the Foreign Service, negotiating and being involved in a lot of important peace processes, in being involved here in State Department, in consultations around issues during the transition from the Portuguese territories to the independence of Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, and et cetera. Way back then, when I was quite a young officer, I remarked to myself how interesting it was that we really were not consulting with Africans on these issues. And that's played out throughout. The most recent example that I can cite for you, and this is one that is, if you go on the website and read this literature, it's spelled out there, but was the announcement of AFRICOM. Now, AFRICOM, of course, from a United States point of view, made all the sense in the world. We had 3 separate military commands who had responsibilities in Africa. And in terms of saving money and reducing bureaucracy and et cetera, it made all the sense in the world to bring them together in a single command, and that would give a specific focus on African issues, something that most Africanists and Africans should have welcomed, of course. But it was done without consultation with anyone on the continent. So when the announcement was made by President Bush in September of 2007, it created a huge controversy on the continent. near panic in many cases. I happened to be in Liberia at that point in time when it was announced, and I remember the talk shows and people calling in to say to the moderator of the talk show that, what was this, the predecessor to an invasion of Africa by the United States? The most reasonable and least panicky interpretation of it was that it was a militarization of American policy, a la Afghanistan and Iraq. But it went further. I mean, there was expectations that American troops are going to be landing everywhere, that this was really going to... Now, most of that, of course, is ridiculous. It wasn't what was in the works. It never was a part of the policy initiative, but it just goes to show what happens and how people misinterpret when you don't consult throughout. And in dialogue around the putting together of the AFRICOM mechanism in the months to follow, and I was involved in some pretty high-level discussions around that. The State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense, of course, were backtracking quickly because they realized the panic that had happened, and they began a consultation process then with a lot of African governments, and they changed some of the original ideas. I mean, the original idea was to locate AFRICOM somewhere on the continent, and they decided to put it in Stuttgart, Germany, as you probably know, and other elements having a focus on development, and in particular on development and agriculture and support of the embassy, and making sure that it was clear that the country team in any country in Africa was still headed by the U.S. ambassador, not by the AFRICOM commander, and that it would still be a civilian-driven policy. But they had to go through all those hoops and over years before it really settled down. And even today, when you're on the continent, there's still a very negative response to AFRICOM. So with that and other experiences of that nature, I had this wonderful opportunity. So I presented a proposal to the Carnegie Corporation, which the actual title of it was The Southern Voice in the Northern Policy Debate. The idea being, of course, to focus on Africa because that's what I know, but actually to theoretically have a larger reach than that to the broader global South, to Brazil in particular, and India and other nations, emerging nations of the global South. But the idea was quite simply to begin to put together a network of existing policy and research institutes on the continent. The role of the Woodrow Wilson Center would be to give those, to not do the research, to not even set the agenda for the research, let the Africans set that agenda, but to give them, to be the conduit for bringing that research to the attention of policy communities here in the United States. So we didn't know if this was going to be something that was welcomed. We held a consultative conference. We were given the money by the Carnegie Corporation to hold a consultative conference in Dakar, Senegal, in September of 2011, to bring together a number of policy institutes that I was aware of and others that I'd run into through the years, and to discuss this with them. They were, of course, overwhelmingly enthusiastic. They really welcomed it. But we had a response from them that I didn't anticipate, but of course, once I heard it, it made sense to me, and that is, not only would this give them a chance to have a direct impact on the formulation of policy in the United States if they could be presenting their research, but that it also would be an opportunity to bring them together because they didn't know each other. We had people, it's expanded since that first consultative conference, but we have people from we have institutions from 9 different countries now, and we're slowly expanding it. So it's South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, Ghana, Egypt, now it's Ivory Coast, Nigeria. I'm missing a few, but they found that even within their country borders, domestically, they seldom worked together on projects, and certainly across the continent they didn't. So we were able to, in our first commissioning of research papers, the one thing we insisted on was that they do it as partners, that they bring together a partnership of, a Kenyan group with a Senegalese group, that sort of thing, and present the papers. But we, as I said, let them then set the agenda. So I just sort of made an opening speech similar to this, and then I said, okay, the agenda is yours now. Decide what it is you feel it is in terms of policy issues that is important to both Africa and the United States. but on which you are convinced that there is a very differing perspective between the United States and Africa. And whether that be climate change, adaptation, maternal health, whether it be conflict issues, the war on terror, for instance, and et cetera, that you feel there's a very differing perspective, sort of historical context, socio-political context, traditional and cultural context that the United States needs to understand. And what emerged from this, of course, were things like the Libyan situation, where most of Africa was very upset by the way the United States responded to Libya, and of course the United States in the policy circles couldn't understand that. So this has served a really good purpose. We commissioned a number of papers, very massive research papers, which were excellent. We were able to set up a number of policy. We brought the authors of the papers to the United States, to Washington, to present these to a number of policy audiences, which were selected very specifically for the subject matter. So the climate change adaptation paper that was done was presented to a group which included EPA, obviously, and others who were involved, in Greenpeace and others, as well as staff and members from the Hill and State Department, USAID, and et cetera. So the first response from the policy community was really, really very positive. So we're very happy with it. We've taken it further now to not only expand it, and we had our second consultative conference for that purpose in Kenya just in early May this year. So we've expanded the number of countries who are involved and the number of institutions who are involved. But we also now have gotten some subsequent funding from the Carnegie Corporation to add one element, and that is to begin to bring research fellows on a select basis, on a competitive select basis, from these institutions to the Woodrow Wilson Center to be here in residence as a research fellow for up to 4 months every year, and we're going to be able to do that with 2 of them a year. Not very many, but it's a good beginning. And we also were able to, and I'll pull this up. We're able to start. This is the website, by the way, for the Southern Voices, and you can. Where am I going? You can click on that, of course, but when you get on there, click on this Africa Up Close, which is our, oops, that cannot be displayed for some reason. Africa Up Close is our blog, which we started in conjunction with this program, and the whole idea there is to give them a regular outlet for pieces, so that it's a unique blog on Africa, because almost all, I do a piece every now and again myself, but it's not an outlet for me to pontificate on what's right or wrong in Africa. It's the main substance of it is the Southern Voices Network participants who write for it, and you'll see when you do get on the blog that there's just some magnificent pieces on different issues. A whole flurry of them. We actually did quite a series around the president's trip to Africa, for instance, where we had members of our network from each of the countries that the president visited. We had Tom Mboya Tom Mboya Jr. from Kenya, who did a wonderful piece on Kenya's reaction to the president not visiting Kenya, so we did quite a bit of analytical work around that. But it's just fascinating, as you'll see, to see the difference in the way major events like that are reported by the Africans as opposed to the way they're reported here in the U.S. press. So that's the theory behind it. That's the structure that we put together. We're hoping it's going to take a life of its own on. These are, I say policy and research institutes because I don't really like the term think tanks very much. But the think tank culture, which we're so used to here in the United States, of which the Woodrow Wilson Center, of course, is one of the most predominant ones, and others like Brookings and CFR and others here in town and around the United States are very prolific and very useful in our policy process. That doesn't exist in Africa. There are a lot of these research institutes who are just loaded with talent. I mean, these are really, really intelligent and prolific and very good scientists and analysts and et cetera, who are looking at just about any issue you can imagine, and some of the work they've done. For instance, I referred to climate change adaptation a moment ago, but I remember in one of our first conversations back in Dakar in 2011, one of the one of the members of the organization that was looking at climate change said to me, well, if you want to talk about adaptation, why aren't they including Africans in the dialogue? Because we've been adapting for 400 years. We've got an awful lot to teach you. And that's the whole lesson learned here, is of course they do. But we never bring them into it. We have our Oslo conferences, we have our Kyoto conferences, we have all these things, and Africans are never present. And it's the same thing over and over again. Now, I don't mean that Africans aren't present. Of course, in G8 and G20 meetings and WTO meetings, Africans are there, but it's at the political level. And even then, it's interesting. I can tell a great first-person story about how Africans are handled in those consultative circles on high-level policy making. Because Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, is a friend of mine. I've known him for some years, and we were together in Bologna, Italy, where we were invited to speak at a conference. And one evening in the course of the conference, we were just sitting, talking, having a brandy together, and sharing some stories. And he said to me, well, we Africans never really get to set the agenda. Because when the G8 was held in Canada in I think it was 2008. I think it's 2008. But anyway, when the G8 was held in Canada, the Prime Minister came up to him beforehand. He had been invited to be at the meeting as the head of the African delegation. He was still president of South Africa. And the Prime Minister said, we really want to come out with an African agenda. We want to set some benchmarks for how the G8 should be working with and partnering with Africa for development and security and et cetera. And he said, oh, absolutely, Gladdy. And Mr. President Mbeki, I would like you to chair that if you would. He said, oh, I'd be glad to. I said, okay, well, here are the issues we think needs to be. And he literally handed him a list to the President of South Africa. He handed him a list of the issues that he felt should be on the agenda that he was supposed to structure. So even at that level, it often is not really the initiative of the African parties. So that's something we're hoping to change and hope this will begin to chip away at. But beyond the good sense that makes to be sure you have African views on African policy issues is what I've discovered since we started the Southern Voices Network, and that is the wealth of information and talent and the depth of research that is fact-based, is empirical, is really good. We are taking the paper that we began with just as a presentation to policy people here. That's evolved now into a whole series on climate change adaptation that we're going to be holding another summit at the Africa Union this early October. With the Africa Union, with a number of the organisms of the Africa Union, including the African Climate Change Policy Center, and really talking about how we can begin to implement at the local, provincial, national, and regional economic communities levels, some adaptation implementation, connecting it, of course, to conflict resolution as well, because they're closely tied together, as we know, in places like the Sahel, northern Mali, and Niger. So it's beginning to have a real impact on policy and the way policy is looked at. But of course it's a constant fight. I mean, it's a constant I'm in touch with members of Congress all the time on the Africa subcommittees in both the House and the Senate, in touch with a lot of people over here, and it's just amazing how much still goes on without them thinking about the African input. For instance, as you probably know, the African Growth and Opportunities Act is coming up, will terminate in 2015. And so this year, a lot of people are looking about how to renew it, enhance it, to to make it a more effective instrument. And particularly members in the House like Karen Bass and Chris Smith of the Africa Subcommittee have taken a lead in this. But when I suggested that amongst your consultations, have you been talking to the African ambassadors, they thought, oh, no, there's a unique idea. And so we were able to effect a series of meetings, breakfasts that we had just right over here on the other side of this building. And those are still ongoing, actually, with the African ambassadors. So you constantly have to fight for this. But this mechanism now has been fun and has given us a means for doing it. We don't know if the funding will last forever. Carnegie has been very supportive up to now, but while it's ongoing, it's really been, I think, a great impact. And I've been really, really happy to be involved in it. And I think I'll leave my opening remarks at that, because we want to have time to share questions and answers. And so let me open the floor. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful initiative and taking the leadership on this initiative. Now, where are you expecting the Woodrow Wilson to be a place where people are going to meet to discuss and set up the agenda? I mean, where will this African voice be heard? Will it be in an African capital? Will it be in Washington? Will it be at a research center? Where exactly?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because obviously we'd like it sort of to be everywhere. But the first thrust of the program, I mean, the Woodrow Wilson Center itself, as you probably know, is, it's here in Washington. Not just the Africa program, but all of the programs of the Woodrow Wilson Center try to reach out to policymakers and engage them and inform them on policy issues in all parts of the world. And so the first thrust of this has been to convene meetings here. And they've taken place at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So we've brought the African participants here, the African research and policy scholars here to make those presentations. Now that was effective and is good. We think that is enhanced now by being able to bring at least a couple of them a year to be residential here, so we can have a lot more interaction with the policy community, and include also with other think tanks, and just to share methodologies and linkages and to create for them more linkages. And as I said, one of the outcomes of all of this is not just the blog, and they're sort of contributing on a regular basis policy pieces, but is also they're working with each other, so that we have been able to spark some partnerships in them doing things on the continent, seeking funding opportunities together as well, which is good. But obviously, where the impact can be felt is also on the continent, and one of the I've said this all in the context of criticizing the U.S. government for not having been consultative enough and transparent enough to bring in the voices of Africa into their consultations. But the odd thing is African governments don't do that either. These people labor, right there in their own capitals, and they don't have any access and impact on their own governments on many of these issues. So that's another thing we're trying to work on. A couple of them, sort of larger ones, we very purposely put together a group of some small, some large, some well-established and well-funded, and some struggling institutions. So that the Institute for Security Studies, for instance, or Cadestria from Senegal, are pretty well-established groups, and they already have some experience in being able to feed policy into their parliaments and into the parliamentary committees and to the federal governments or the national governments themselves. So we're encouraging them to work with some of the smaller ones in the other countries where there's not. Cadestria, of course, is Senegal, and ISS is from South Africa, where the civil society machinery is more sophisticated than it is in other countries. So in places like particularly in the Ivory Coast or Ethiopia or South Sudan, who's also become a member and are a brand new nation, of course, there's no history there. And so they've got a lot to learn from their fellow Africans. So that's very much a part of what we're trying to do, but that part is just beginning. On the climate change adaptation that I mentioned, that's going to be a real focus of this meeting we're holding in Addis. It'll be under AU African Union auspices, which we hope will give it some power, but the whole idea is how do you engage your local governments, how do you engage your national governments, how do you engage local leaders as well, including traditional leaders, in practices and ways of adapting to climate change. So it's a goal, but a very, very important one. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Well, the first question is, yeah, I mean, we had to start somewhere, and so I started with some organizations I knew or I knew of, and I did go out and interview some, or take opportunities to interview some when I was traveling in the country, and I knew about them. We're limited financially by how many we could bring in, just in order and able to commission the studies and to help people travel and that sort of thing. So the first thrust was, I think, 6 countries and 12 organizations, and it's expanded now to 9 countries and 18 organizations. So we would hope it would eventually include the whole continent. But the way we've expanded is to consult with our members. The first round choice was one I made arbitrarily, based on my own experience and thinking that would be fairly representative of the continent. We tried to be sure we had east, west, south, north, or Ethiopia, and we had francophone, anglophone. But after that, we then made the expansion in consultation with the members. We can't just, openly invite them to invite anybody they want because of the financial constraints, which leads to the second question, because the hope is that it'll be a freestanding, self-organized effort in the end. But at least for the foreseeable future, I think there's a very important role for the Woodrow Wilson Center. Part of it is in terms of the presentation, the conduit for presentation of research findings to the policy community here, which some of them probably could do on their own to a certain extent, but we make it a lot easier. And we do have the convening authority and can bring bodies of policymakers from the executive and legislative branches together pretty easily. So that's a role that we play. When we had this second consultative conference that I just mentioned in Nairobi in May, the intention was actually on our part that would probably be the last one. From that point forward, our role would be just sort of to continue to encourage them to work together, let them pick the ball up and all. But they were the ones who said they would like to hold, and now one of them has offered to host a third consultative conference in South Africa next year, because they think our organizing those is very helpful for them in terms of the networking it allows them to do amongst themselves, in terms of the ideas that flow out of it, and et cetera. So at least for the short term, I think we'll be very much involved. Of course, the matter of money always comes up, and if we weren't able to be supportive on that regard, what would happen would be the bigger ones would keep on going and smaller ones would fall out of the picture, and that's what we're trying to protect, because there's really only, probably in all of Africa, only about 4 or 5 think tanks, as we call them, that are totally viable themselves, and already have some international interactions and connections and et cetera. So So they need that help organizationally right now to keep the smaller ones in, who have an awful lot to offer, are normally focused on just some specific issues. Like one is maternal health and family planning, et cetera, an organization out of Kenya, which is just brilliant, but they don't have any money. They struggle daily. So this has really been a boon for them. I always try to work myself out of a job. As you know, on the conflict resolution work that we talked about those years ago in Burundi and DRC and Liberia, well, now the Burundi Leadership Training Program and the Initiative for Cohesive Leadership, is turning it around in the French acronym, for the Congo, they're freestanding. We don't. We're not involved at all in the funding or in the administration or anything, and I serve as a consultant to them now. So that's always the objective in the end, is to have them be totally independent. Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
The history of the Berlin Conference. So, setting that aside and acknowledging the reality of our history, I just wanted to ask a question with respect to the ISS, for example, and their policy work, the Institute for
Mm-hmm.
Study, and the fact that they contribute quite a lot of work to policy making functions at the African Union. What will I'm trying to understand the flow of information. So bringing these think tanks or policy research groups together, number one, the example you gave of Pablo Mbeki, the presenter of the agenda, who establishes the agenda for this coalition of groups?
Mm-hmm.
Who decides what the topics of discussion or research will be? Who prioritizes them? And to benefit who in the end? Are they benefiting the AU? Do they continue to trigger policy decisions of the AU? Are they just sort of decided by what our priorities are here in the United States? And finally, how does the Wilson Center influence the final product of any study?
Okay. Well, the question, I was asked to repeat the questions for the sake of the recording. I didn't repeat any of the first questions. But this is who sets the agenda, how are priorities set, what is the role of the center in that, and first of all, I mean, in sometimes when I talk about this, I go back to the Berlin Conference where I start my lack of consultation speech. But I alluded to it, but obviously I didn't make it clear that the research agenda, the subject matter, the content, is all decided by the African participants. And even in our first consultation, a consultative conference in Dakar, when I presented, I was being absolutely literal when I said I made a speech sort of like this, referring to the fact that African voices have never been included in, or seldom been included in policymaking in the United States. And if you agree that that's a need, let's discuss that. We spent some time discussing it. Everybody agreed that that was a need. Then I said, well, then we are in a position, that is the Woodrow Wilson Center, to be able to work with you in presenting policy papers on issues of your choosing to a policy community in Washington. The idea then was not, as in answering to Marjorie's question, the idea was not yet fleshed out about how to influence the African Union or national governments or local governments. It was about how to influence U.S. policymakers, which is what the grant was written for from Carnegie Corporation. So from that point forward, it was the African participants from all of these organizations, including the ISS, Institute of Security Studies, who talked about, we did their own workshop and wrote on the flip charts all kinds of policy issues that they felt were important, and ones in which they saw there were, or they felt there were differing perspectives between the United States policy community and Africans, and then made a decision on 5 areas of policy concern that they would like to do the first round of research on. And then they chose amongst themselves who would partner on those research papers. So we neither selected the organizations nor selected the subject matter. We then commissioned those papers to be done that they had identified to us, and gave them some stipends for actually doing the research. And then, as I said, brought the individuals here for presenting of those papers, which were published as well. But we did very intense workshops with select policy communities, I said, to have the authors of the paper present those. Now, an organization like the ISS, you're quite right, does have, I mean, they have an office in Addis, as you probably know, and it's a very effective office, works very closely with the Africa Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa on several issues, and climate change is actually one of them, but the ISS is unusual, and CODESRIA are unusual in that they have multi-country programs, as well as a very extensive agenda around several different subjects. Most of the other organizations that I'm not naming, because you probably wouldn't know most of them, and I wouldn't remember all of them anyway, but it includes some that are probably better known, like KY Amoka's African Center for Economic Transformation is one of our partner institutes. And they do an awful lot of wonderful, wonderful research and thinking around economic and development issues. But again, they don't have that profile and that exposure to the policy communities. So what we're hoping a next step is, and we're working on that this fall, is of course to engage the Africa Union with them. But again, the whole point is, and the answer to your question is, the agenda has been set by them. I've been very specific that our role. I mean, when the papers came in, the final papers, we of course took the liberty to do another edit, but it was just factual and fact checked and looking for just minor errors. But the substance of the papers and the style of the papers, we changed nothing in the presentations that were made. So we play no substantive role on this, and quite on purpose. And some of these are issues, particularly on the conflict resolution side, about which I have a great deal of expertise, but I am absolutely not interfering in any way, nor any of my staff, in trying to guide the way the conclusions and substance will go. And obviously, there's a lot of things that come out in disagreement. The war on terror is a good one because there, as we know, the United States, of course, identifies the war on terror in the African context as a fight against international terrorism. So it's wherever Al-Qaeda, in whatever form it is located, where they want to respond. Whereas from an African point of view, it is a conflict over marginalized peoples and issues around poverty and climate change and other things that have caused some parties, some groups to be dissatisfied with their government, and international terrorists have taken advantage of that. But the solution to it is never military in African eyes. The solution has to be in addressing the core problems that cause the dissatisfaction, dislocation, and marginalization of peoples in between. And this is a real difference of view from what U.S. policymakers see it, the way U.S. policymakers see it. And so those presentations have been pretty rich and fiery between people on the individual members on the Armed Services Committee and our national intelligence agencies and et cetera, when they came to listen to the conflict presentation by our African participants. So it's not just the delivering of a paper. It's a real discussion around these issues that try to get at the heart of how we view these things, and how we, the United States, are viewing them incorrectly. I saw this one first. Yes.
Personally, I have issues regarding unfair international trade agreements, like you say, climate change, and policy of democratization during Bush administration. That I think one of them made foreign policies during that administration. So again, thank you for creating such an initiative. So my question is, like, what makes this initiative different from the other, like, initiatives that are out there, think tank organizations, which claim to be like helping the country, that continent is going from? I mean, other than creating the discussion and prioritizing the action that's by us, how do you like translate this policy into real actions that we can implement from the people around? And how influential are you eventually bring about vital sound?
Well, the question is first of all, how is this effort different than others that are going on the continent? And then second of all, how are we having an impact? How are we? The last part of the question is one I can be quick on because, we're only beginning to see the impact, and because we're only beginning to explore the other really important dimension of it, and that is to influence policy issues on the continent itself, from continental, that is the Africa Union, to regional, to the various regional commissions, to national and local policy. So we'll see how that works out. Already there's some inroads there on, for instance, on maternal health and family planning issues in Kenya, where they were able to influence the writing of the Constitution, the new Constitution, a couple of years ago. So we'll begin to see some impact on that. But what makes this different is an interesting question, because it was my experience, of course, after spending 43 years working on and in Africa. I had just my own impression, fairly well-informed impression, but still impression of my own, was that there wasn't really anything like this being done that connected African thinkers, and as I said, researchers and empirical scientists and et cetera, to policy considerations in the United States. And as I investigated it, it was true. There really is not another effort to do this. Now, that doesn't mean that important African thinkers are not involved sometimes in discussions around this, but it's not been done in exactly this way. For instance, the Brookings Institute, its Africa Growth Initiative, which you're probably familiar with, does every year select 4 African research scientists or research policy individuals to come and be present on their staff here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and they use them in workshops and seminars and symposia they give for policy community. And so there is an African voice. They're here, but they're being asked to, of course, talk about an agenda that's been set by the Brookings Institute. And yes, they're being asked to bring their own research and their own views and et cetera. So there are other efforts. I know that the Rockefeller Foundation also initiated a sort of outreach to think tanks in Africa, and had a meeting in Tanzania about 2 years ago, where they brought 5 or 6 different institutions to talk about a similar kind of network. But in the end, again, it was the Rockefeller Institution that was setting their priorities and their policy issues that they felt were important, and so that hasn't gotten off the ground. The same thing has happened with the Human Sciences Research Council out of New York City, which started something called the African Peace Building Network, which again is research institutes from around the continent who are being invited to present papers to them on different peace building, conflict resolution subjects. And again, this is all very valuable work, but it's responding to the priorities and policies of the organizations that are funding it. We're the only one that I know of at all who has gone out and organized a group, yes, but who said the agenda is yours. You set it, you present it, you do all the work because I want it to be totally your view. And so that's the difference. In my years of working in Africa, the one thing I've always been very conscious of, very sensitive to, I should say, is not reinventing the wheel, not trying, get an idea and I find somebody else is doing it to compete with them or to do it better so that so I checked around. I didn't just have an idea that was sort of based on my intuitive sense that this wasn't being done before. I looked around everywhere I could to see if there was anybody already doing something like this, and I didn't find it. I didn't see it. There is a think tank network by that name being organized internationally by the University of Pittsburgh by a man named Jim McCann. And I may link with him because the idea there is to try to organize think tanks from all over the world, including Africa, into a unit that can be helpful in getting funding to them from international donors. So it's not based on the substance of the research itself or anything. It's just trying to be supportive and do some capacity building for the think tank. So I'm talking with Mr. McCann to see about working with him. But those are all the efforts that I'm aware of on Africa. And Africa, by the way, the United States has about 4,500 think tanks. The top ones we all know, CFR and Brookings and Woodrow Wilson Center and Heritage and all these. Africa in total has about 200 think tanks. The majority, well, not the majority of them, but the bulk of the most effective ones are in South Africa. There's about 25 in South Africa alone that qualify for the think tank moniker. So it's a culture that's just emerging there. Where we're dealing with 1 billion people, and it's something that has been part of our society and culture, I guess, since Mr. Carnegie and Mr. Rockefeller began doing these things a few years ago. And European culture to a certain extent, but it's really just beginning to happen in what we used to call the developing world, and so it's also to help to nourish that, because I think that part of civil society is really, really important in terms of keeping government transparent and responsible and et cetera, and so that's why we're happy to be involved in it. Yes, sir. Sure. Yeah.
By a powerful figure.
Yeah.
Another one is funding. And I'm very curious. You mentioned 45 organizations who see think tanks that are pretty much self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm.
And are they all in South Africa? And secondly, who sustains them? Because another form of capture is economic.
Mm-hmm.
Not just government. And in the U.S., we are transparent. You have a habit of transparency. We know Carnegie, Rockefeller, the people who are supporting them. We can take what you say and like that. Who is supporting the self-sustaining think tanks in Africa?
Mm-hmm.
Is it foundation-based? Is it government-based? Is it private philanthropy? Who is actually sustaining them over time? And I would like, just personally, because I'm very interested in Congo, if you would also look at that in terms of conflict resolution with Burundi and Congo, who is supporting those organizations?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question, and maybe the question. There are no self-sustaining think tanks in Africa. They all are funded primarily from the outside, except for those that get government funding. And there was a ticklish problem for me. Should we even have government funded think tanks in this? Because we wanted independent thinking, obviously. But it's not a compromise really, but it's kind of a decision whether, for instance, there's the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa, which is one of our network, and it gets about 50% of its funding from the South African government. The rest of it gets from outside. And we ended up deciding to let them be a member because the work that they were doing for government was similar kind of to what the Congressional Research does here. It was like a parliamentary committee wanted an economic study on something, so they were commissioned to do it. It wasn't political in nature. But then the other part of that question of where does the funding come from? It comes from everyone that you can suspect. They're out fundraising everywhere. So a lot of our big foundations, like Ford and Rockefeller and MacArthur and et cetera, are funding a lot of these think tanks. They do get some funding from the World Bank. They do get some funding from the Africa Development Bank. They do get some funding from European-based institutions like like the Commonwealth Fund in England and the German party-based funds. So they seek funding wherever they can get that. And in one sense, it's great that they are able to get some support, but it means there's no security for them. And that's part of what we're hoping to do is help them not only in their own capacity building, but eventually getting some secure basis of funding. But the downside of that, as you can easily guess, is of course that the funders, our funders, never come without some strings attached, because then again that sort of dictates an agenda. Because the Ford Foundation has its priority areas that it funds in. And so you've got to fit into one of those priority areas in order to get this funding. It's a dichotomy that you can't quite do away with. How that influences the direction of their research. It's just not an open agenda for any of them. But none of them are self-sustaining. None of them have been endowed and live off of that endowment, or there's one exception to that, but it's a very different kind of animal, and that is Mo Ibrahim's the Ibrahim Leadership Initiative. Forget the exact title of it, but he does his Freedom Index and all these things. And of course, he's a multi-billionaire himself, and he funds that, but it's a very specific leadership democratization focus. And he doesn't fund other think tanks and other democracy and governance people. The people who are working in conflict resolution and sort of, when you begin to break it down and go beyond kind of the research and policy institutes that I'm talking about, and get into human rights groups and law groups and conflict resolution groups who are emerging around the continent, again, it's kind of hit and miss, and they've got to search for funding wherever they can. On the conflict resolution side, a lot of support comes out of the Scandinavian governments. The Norwegians, the Swiss, the Swedish in particular, and then there's other smaller sort of donor organizations like Humanitarian United and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue out of Geneva, and a few others, who support an awful lot of that kind of work, that community reconciliation work and post-conflict work. The work we did in Burundi and et cetera was actually originally funded by the World Bank. And then the British government, Department for International Development, DFID, took over some of that funding. So there are funders out there, but it's all from outside. There's no inter-African funding except for Mo Ibrahim. And there are other very rich Africans, of course. It's interesting why that's not coming forward. I'm watching very carefully. For instance, there's a multi-millionaire in Nigeria named Tony Emelu, who's created a foundation now, but it's not clear yet what he's going to be funding with that money. But I think as time goes by, you'll get this kind of thing emerging with African capital able to support some of these efforts. Okay, I see Eve standing up, about to cut us off.
Yes, I want to encourage people to visit the website, which most of you have free computers, will not be blocked, and look at the website and the papers. There's a very extensive paper, a 37-page paper that talks about Southern Voices, as well as a lot of other interesting resources that can give you additional information.
Well, I would say, yeah, when you go in there, I'm not quite sure where it is, but the 5 major research papers that we did last year and presented, the whole papers are on there, the entire papers. And it's one was on climate change, as I've said, one was on immigration issues and brain drain, one was on family health, family planning, one was on conflict resolution, and what was the 5th one? I've forgotten. But anyway, they're on there, so you can find them.
So we encourage you to visit the website. I want to thank Steve McDonald very much. This has been very insightful, and we look forward to hearing some progress reports as things go on over the years. And thank you very much for coming and joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.